Slightly blustery but very beautiful Groundswell, and we're here to talk about land advice, and we've got an amazing panel lined up here. And just out of interest, just to let you know that this session is going to be recorded, and all of the recordings from our previous sessions are available on our channels, so do have a look at that, hit the like button and check out those. We've got some amazing sessions on there. So my name is Stevenson. I'm Land Advice Service Manager for the Wildlife Trust, and my job is to support and coordinate all of our amazing land advisors out there across the 46 wildlife trusts, which is a heck of a lot of people. And I think what a lot of people don't realise is that actually land advice is a really key part of our work going forwards. So we're really proud to say that there are literally more wildlife trust nature reserves than there are branches of McDonald's across the country. But actually an even more interesting fact is that we have more than 200 land advisors out there. And this is an area of work that we're really looking to increase going forwards. Because, and to sort of cut to the point really, we cannot deliver nature's recovery without advice work. We cannot own our way out in order to get to nature's recovery. So advice is going to be incredibly important for us going forwards. And we've heard a heck of a lot about it at the Groundswell Festival here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our panel. I'm going to ask them to talk about their work, about what they're involved in, and we've got people from different organisations here as well. And we're really proud to say that we actually work across with other NGOs as well. So I'm really pleased that the RSPB are here. We collaborate across something called the Farm Wildlife, about something called 6 Key Actions, and we're really proud to work together with people like the RSPB to roll out this really good farm advice sort of piece of work. So I'm going to introduce Richard Winspear from the RSPB, and I'd love it if you could just tell us a little bit about your work and all the different things you've got going on.
Hi. Yes. So basically, my background is that working? My background is in setting up and developing a network of advisors across the UK. We recruited a range of people. Some had started with an agricultural background and we trained them in ecology. Some started off with an ecology background and we trained them in agriculture. Both kind of approaches worked. I myself started off very much in the ecology camp, even though I've got a background in family farming in market gardening and dairy. I went and studied ecology, came to the RSPB and studied stone coolies and found stone coolies in Wessex. And I was working with farmers on stone coolies, and my approach was, I know the ecology of stone coolies, you know arable farming, bring the two together and we can work through how we sort this out, because the trajectory was that the population would go extinct by the year 2000, and this was 1990. And my experience was that the farming expertise was absolutely essential in coming up with a solution. Probably my biggest claim to fame is I set up the very first fallow plot for ground nesting birds under stewardship. And it was, if I'm honest, the credit should go to an individual farmer who said, well, if that's what the stone coolie needs, I'm better off just, how much land do I need to create as a fallow? And you pay me to do that, and then I don't need to worry about whether they're in my crops or not. They'll be in that fallow. So it was a farmer that should be credited for the very first stone coolie plot, which went on to become the lapwing plot, which is now a widely available agri-environment scheme option. I was talking exclusively about stone coolies, and the same farmer was getting advice about brown hair streaks from Butterfly Conservation, rare arable plants from Plant Life, and he was getting different advice from everyone who came down the drive. So when I started in the national role, my first priority was really to get all of those experts together and think, well, actually, how do we restore nature on farmland? There must be a recipe that does it all. And that's when we came up with the Farm Wildlife Partnership and the 6 Key Actions. And basically, all you have to do with the 6 Key Actions is tailor them to the priority species in your landscape, but there's never only one priority species. Where you've got seal buntings, you've got grey long-eared bats, greater horseshoe bats, rare arable plants. So you have to basically tailor it to the priority species of your landscape, and then immediately the breadth of the nature in that landscape will benefit, because it's all evolved around those things which are unique to that landscape, which are displayed by those priority species. And really, that's the expertise we bring to all of the advisors within the network. And like I say, the expertise behind that is as much farmer as it is ecology. And we have the Nature Friendly Farming Network in the partnership, as well as the Wildlife Trusts and all the taxa specialist NGOs. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Can I come over to Carrie, please? Can you tell us a little bit about your work and your various projects you've got going on?
That would help if I turned it on. That's a good start, isn't it? Hello, everyone. I'm Carrie Starbuck. I'm the Land Advice Service Manager for Future Nature, which is the consultancy arm of the Berkshire, Bucks and Oxon Wildlife Trust. I always have to take a massive breath after that because it's such a mouthful. So we call it BBOUT for short. My background is actually in education and community. I worked with teenagers that couldn't stay in mainstream education, and the harder the kid or the tougher the kid, the more I loved them, which might explain why I get on so well with farmers. The tougher the farmer, the grumpier the farmer, the more I'm like, I'm going to break you down and work with you. So I was running my own business in education, and it grew really quickly. And I was studying for my master's in education. And I was looking at men's mental health in particular, because I was constantly just seeing boys coming through my doors, white working class boys predominantly. And I thought, oh God, we've got a problem here. What is it? So my dissertation was on men's mental health. And I decided to pack everything I own into my VW camper van, including my dog, and research men's mental health and compare the UK to France, Spain and Portugal. And it was that journey that led me to understand or have a greater understanding of our relationship with nature and how it impacts well-being. So when I came back to the UK, I did a career change and went into conservation. And I worked for the National Trust in the Peak District as their land and nature delivery manager. And I led on their 50-year plans for climate and nature. And my job in particular was to work and support and empower their tenant farmers. And I absolutely, hook, line and sinker, fell in love with farming, and particularly the effect and the power of grazing animals on the landscape. So I am now a hopeful new entrant, and I'm in the process of starting my own conservation grazing venture, to which you'll introduce Romilly in a minute. Romilly is one of my farmers in the steering group of cluster group that I work with, and hopefully she'll provide me with a starter flock of sheep. So, but I joined the Wildlife Trust only in October to really lead and develop a new land advice service for Future Nature and the BBOUT. And in that time, it's grown massively. So we work on a real varied project, field by field, but also at a landscape scale. So we work individually with farmers, particularly with SFIs and countryside stewardship schemes, and helping to navigate those changes. But we also work with entire cluster groups, particularly for BNG, and landscape recovery schemes as a way of BNG being part of that blended finance model that landscape recovery is all about. And other things like South East Water, working with them to enhance nature, wildlife and water quality in the Lower Thames. So it's incredibly varied and exciting land advice service to be part of, because it's so different. And I think one of the things that has evolved out of the agricultural transition is this emergence of a nature and land advice service and the need and demand for it. And I think it's an exciting, challenging, but exciting time to be part of the industry. So the analogy I always keep coming back to is a bit like farmers. Well, normally you might agree or disagree, but they're in a really stormy sea on a ship at the moment. And if you think about all the external factors like DEFRA, climate change, that's the wind and the rain and the stormy sea. And the farmer's the captain of the ship, but they're losing a bit of control and they don't know what direction to go in. And so I see advisors, or how I want my land advisors to be, is that second mate. So they're the second hand on that wheel, steadying the ship, helping getting the teammates around them to all go in the same direction and guide them to smoother seas. And yeah, I think it's an exciting time.
Thank you. Yes, that is really exciting. That's better. Thank you very much, Carrie. Microphone problems. I'd like to come over to Romilly now, because you are an inspiring shepherdess and an educator, and you're part of a cluster group actually out there doing farming, and that's why we wanted you on the panel. So could you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
So I think that I'm going to have microphone. No, is that working? Right, okay. So I grew up on a small holding. We I milked goats. That was my childhood. And then we got nobbled by the pasteurisation changes and the laws back in the 70s. And my family eventually emigrated, and that was that. But I carried on and went on into botany. That was my thing. Plants, love plants. They stay still. And so that took me by a roundabout route to get into natural dyeing. So that's what I do professionally. I've done that now for 20 years. And through that, it's like, obviously, you've got to dye something. And sadly, or not sadly, I don't know, I just really, really love goats. And sheep are just basically woolly goats. And so I ended up with a lot of sheep. But I live on an organic estate called Hardwick Estate. It is absolutely beautiful. It's on the River Thames. And part of the decision to get sheep was because of my botanical interests, really. Just walking the hills and fields there. It's chalk grassland. It's absolutely beautiful. And I wanted to be part of looking after that. Like Carrie, I'd worked in education, so all my adult life, alongside the natural dyeing, I'd been working with kids who had fallen out of mainstream education, and that's what I still do as well. So the flock has three purposes, actually. So number one, to look after the chalk grassland, and that is really, really important to me. Pretty much all my decisions are informed by what the land tells me to do, not the other way around. I mean, obviously there's sticky points where you're just stuck with a load of sheep that have just got out of a field and you've got to put them somewhere where you shouldn't. But apart from that, I try and really look after the land. Obviously, I am the sheep also are working therapeutically with all the youngsters as well. So that's a really, beautiful thing, and watching the impact that they have. And also, from an educational point of view, one of the biggest problems is that most kids just want to do something that is relevant, real, and has a point. So if that fence broke and the sheep got out, then my youngsters that come and work with me, we'll rebuild the fence, or we might do some coppicing, or we might do some surveying. Sometimes I can get them interested in plants. And then, and then the other thing the sheep do is obviously provide fleece. So we're part of the fibre shed movement, and looking into getting the narrative around textiles, educating people, and hoping that people will start thinking about the clothes that they wear differently, and the impact that has not only on our environment here, but more importantly on the environments where textiles are made in other places where we don't see the conditions that they're made in, and the impacts that it has on the environments there. So that's my background.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Romilly. So I'm going to come over to Tim now. Tim is working in beautiful Gloucestershire. I'm not biased at all, but Gloucestershire is a very varied county of stark contrast between places like the Severn Vale and the Cotswold Hills. But can you tell us a bit more about your projects and your work?
Thank you, Ian. You hear me okay? So advice in Gloucestershire, and why do we do it? We as an organisation, our history is managing nature reserves within Gloucestershire. And what do we own, Ian? About 1,000 hectares of land? We are never going to get nature's recovery by the land that we own. We're never going to buy a significant amount of Gloucestershire to achieve that. We have to work with the landowners, and that's the farmers of Gloucestershire, because they own most of Gloucestershire, and we have to influence. Now, how do we go about that? How do we do that? Because we've got limited resource. We haven't got 1,000 people out there advising 10,000 farmers. In fact, I've got to think how many farmers there are in Gloucestershire. 3,000, something like that. They are losing their income from direct farming supports. So they're actually looking around at the moment and thinking, how can I replace that income? How can I shore up my business and make sure I've got a long-term future? We give advice in loads of different ways. There's only 2 of us that directly do it, but there's a whole group of people that do give advice throughout the trust. So a lot of our nature reserve managers will talk to farmers over the fence, our neighbours. And if they like what we do and they recognise these guys, they're actually okay, and they've done a really good job. We've got these large blues here. So we've got these farmers all around one of our great reserves, Daneway, and they've looked at what we're doing, and actually we want some of that. We'd like to be able to do that. So, sorry, okay. So they've they've come on board because of that, and that's one instance. We've got the reserve managers throughout the county that know their neighbours and give this casual advice. We need to do more of that. I mean, how do we do that at scale? So we're looking at various ways. We might have it project funded. So we've got a few quite big projects running at a landscape scale through Gloucestershire. So we've got treescapes as one option, where we're actually giving free advice to farmers, trying to get through this miasma of woodland grants and problems, and easing the way in to make it easy for farmers to be able to put in trees in the landscape, maybe increase their look at their orchards, where we can get something, improvements to hedgerow management, all of these things, one instance. We've got a big wetland project. We've got yieldscapes up the Severn, where we're involved with engaging the farmers in that area and trying to explain to them what this land use change is going to be and what it's going to look like and what their options are, what sort of funding they're going to get. And they're a long way. They all realise they're in this state where they're losing their land, it's flooding so much. So where can I get some income? What can I do? How can I make up for this? So where it's a really big, complicated project, and we're trying to draw something out and come up with something at the end of it, but it's quite exciting. Our other work, we've been looking at landscape recovery is a big issue for us, and it's one bit of elms that you're aware of that I think is quite exciting. We've had sort of stewardship in its different forms for quite a while, and it hasn't really, argue with me afterwards, it doesn't really change that much. Even what we've got now, we've got SFI, it's a very similar way, and it does bits, but at scale we've now got something called landscape recovery, which I think is a brilliant opportunity for wildlife trusts to work with lots of farmers at scale and long term. And that's quite exciting for me. Sadly, I failed with a bid last year. And now we've gone into an election, and I was hoping to get one this year. And it's looking at grassland restoration within the Cotswolds. And it was a huge consortium of bodies doing this. The Cotswolds used to have massive areas of lowland calcareous grassland. It's a wonderful habitat. It's a wonderful wildflower habitat. We will still go for that, but we need the opportunity to fund that, and we need a way of engaging lots of farmers, and we need that development funding over a couple of years to get that set up and going. And we've started to look at that. We're in the Cotswold National Landscape, so we've attracted some funding through FIPL. So we're working with a lower number of farmers just to learn what the problems are and to learn the process of how we can create biodiversity units and have something to sell, something to offer to investors. So it's a bit of a learning stage for us, and then when we get the chance to go for bigger sums of money, we can then scale that up. There are other ways. We're also in the process of, we've just set up a facilitation fund with that group of farmers to work with them long term. There's a downside with project funding in that we may engage with farmers for a short time, we give them some advice, and then the project funding runs out and we leave them, and it's not satisfactory. We need these long-term relationships, and something like a facilitation fund is a great way of continually doing meetings, learning. You become a trusted advisor to those farmers, and you can easily influence what they do, and you can find them funding opportunities to do those changes and to improve their farming, reduce their pesticide loading, all of these things to try to get insects back and to get the birds back and everything that used to be there. I'm old enough to know what farms used to look like in the 60s, and I remember my dad's farm when I was a child. I used to get bombarded by lapwing and peewits, that we called them. There were so many on the farm. There were curlew everywhere. And do you know what happened? My dad got paid to drain grassland. It is so sad. And sadly, guess what happened? The curlew went, the lapwing went. And so I've seen all of that. And what we're asking people to do now is to actually reverse that process. So don't underestimate how difficult that is. I've also worked in agricultural education. And we've been telling farmers over years to produce food, increase production. And now we're actually saying, whoa, you know, we're actually asking people to reverse. And it's a clash. It's a difficult thing to get through, that we now to explain to farmers that having this wonderful pure ryegrass lay isn't just the best thing in the world, and they'd be used to doing that. So it is a change to go back to looking, sometimes that looks like a scruffy landscape, where you've got patches of scrub and rush and habitat, and it's not clean and tidy, but we need to sort of change this culture. And it's a big, big step for us, but we have to do it. We have to do it. If we need to get nature's recovery, we have to do this. And it's great fun. And if there's anybody out there in the youth that engaging with farmers in this is great, it's fantastic. And when you see that change and you see farmers going, oh yeah, okay, I'll do that, I'll accept that. And then the next time it might be something bigger, but we're on that process and on that journey of making these steps. But it's great when you see you've actually gone out and you've asked somebody to do something and they've done it and it's worked. It's great. It's really good. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Mike's not working again, but I think that is a really cool message. Bring back scruffiness, and if you want to be an advisor, do it, because we need many more advisors out there. Richard, I wanted to come to you again as well, because obviously you're leading a national team. I'm really interested in kind of like the nuts and bolts of what you're actually able to offer farmers. So through your different projects, what kind of interventions are you offering, and what are farmers really interested to take up?
Okay, so I have to say that RSPB advice is directed at some of our priority species, so some of the species which have declined most seriously. So we have advice on turtle doves, but through the work with the Farm Wildlife Partnership, basically I'm absolutely confident that, you know, whether you go to an RSPB advisor or a Wildlife Trust advisor, anyone on the partnership, you will get consistent, high quality farm conservation advice. The 6 key actions, I should say, the postcards that are scattered around, and if you haven't got access to one, there's a pile on the table with the camera on at the back. Those 6 key actions can be applied to any farming system anywhere in the UK, and they will restore nature. One thing I would say on what Tim has just said is that what we really want is productive, nature-friendly farming, and I do not accept the idea that being nature-friendly needs to be less productive. I'm actually optimistic that we will have nature-friendly farming in the future that is more productive than conventional farming, because apply regenerative agriculture, focus on the functional biodiversity of field margins and pollinators and crop pest predators, natural pest control, look after your soils, and you will be, in the long term, more productive with low input farming. And that's what is really focusing my mind now. We're applying Regen Ag at our Hope Farm, and we are restoring our soils from what was a very degraded farm only 8 years ago. We actually went conventional for 15 years, and we've only recently started looking at regen as a way to look after the 90% which is still farmed. The 10% habitat is all part of that functional biology that we need. The SFI is a fantastic menu of options to deliver the 6 key actions and the 5 principles of regenerative agriculture. The one thing I would say about it is that it lacks the detail and it lacks the guidance to get farmers the outcomes that they want. And farmers will be looking for advice, because farmers don't want to get tick boxes for Regen Ag. They want to actually have the outcomes of Regen Ag. That's the whole point. And I think advice around that is going to be desperate. And what we really need is for all farmers to have access to high quality advice, be it from the Wildlife Trust, RSPB, FLAG, wherever.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. That's really interesting. And in fact, in a recent DEFRA survey, most farmers says they feel that advice is essential in order to deliver those outcomes of SFI. So it is incredibly important. But I'm really interested, Romilly, in just sort of turning around to the other end of the telescope, if I can. What are you really interested in kind of implementing on your land and through your work? What kind of nature-friendly practices are you interested in?
So I've done a lot of nature-friendly practices already. It was partly why I got into farming. You know, I actually wrote a bit of a list of them. One of them, I mean, it's an organic estate, All the land has been organic since 1975, albeit we're bringing more in now just because some of it was horse land. But within the rules, I can use something called click on the sheep. It stops, my mind's gone dead, fly strike. And I don't. It's nerve-wracking, but I don't. There's various other herbal things that I could use, but actually nothing really beats just observing them twice daily and making sure there is no sign of any strike there. In some fields, it's really tricky, and I have to keep them off some of the fields that are cleaner, less flies in them, at this time of the year because the orchids are flowering, and I have to push them down onto the river meadows, and then it's even more worrying, even though they have been shorn and that sort of thing, and I've come to Groundswell and I'm really worrying about it. But that's a really important thing. I don't get any money for doing that. It's really stressful, but I do it anyway because where I live is so diverse. If I have a negative impact on the insects there, I don't think I'd have a very good conscience about it. So that's a really big thing that I think some people don't think about. I have primitive sheep, so they graze slightly differently to a lot of other sheep. So, I mean, to be honest, in some respects this is a problem because they're going to eat. They love bushes, basically. Any shrubbery, bushes, anything, often the other side of the fence. But anyway, they're good with that. The rotation of them, I have to be really, really careful with. If I top a field to clean it up a little bit, which I don't do much of, as you say, untidy, it's good. Because we've been organic for so long, we actually have some very curious, often men, creeping around the estate who are very interested in things like moths and things like that. And these people are fantastic. So I often take them around the estate and I have learned so much from them, and it makes me realise the complications of every bit of advice. Because there was I thinking, hogweed's bad, don't like hogweed, not the giant one, but the smaller one, and I try and get rid of that, if possible, and, from certain areas. But then the mothmen come along and they're just like, oh, God, that's so good, seeing so much of that. Look at all those insects having sex on there, and I was just like, wow, right, okay. I'll look at that in a different way, won't I? So there are different ways of looking at everything. I have a problem with agrimony burrs. If anybody knows that plant, it has like these little burrs that get stuck in sheep fleece. And if I exclude sheep from land where it's orchids are flowering, what happens? The agrimony goes to seed and sticks in the sheep fleece, rendering it useless. So how do I navigate around that? Where's the advice for that sort of thing? When you get to the minutiae, there's some broad scale things that all of us can do, but there's so much in the detail, and that's where I get a bit lost.
Brilliant. And we managed to get onto the hogweed bonking beta, which is always a really good thing. So I mean, coming to Groundswell, you see about 1 million different acronyms. And if you're a land manager out there, you're hearing about natural flood management, you're hearing about farm assurance schemes, biodiversity net gain, farming in protected landscapes, water company initiatives, and all sorts of different things. So Carrie, how do you help farmers steer through that, like miasma as you described it, of different acronyms?
Yeah. It's quite overwhelming, isn't it? The funding. You were just talking to me about it. The funding world at the moment, and it's frustrating because it's changing all the time. So I guess how I see myself helping with that is, a farmer is a farmer. They're very busy people. They don't have time to sit and read 100-page documents. Whereas me as an advisor, sadly, I do have a little bit more time to do that hard work behind the scenes. So when someone like Romilly is talking about how she's managing the land, I could be like, oh, there's a payment for that. Do you know native breed? There's a native breed payment now. So it's like, things like that to help them navigate that landscape. I have to say, like personally, a bit like you've alluded to some projects that you're working on and how funding has allowed you to do that. I will pay homage to farming and protected landscape funding in particular. It's such a fantastic pot. And for us as advisors, it's been a brilliant way of reaching farmers that might not necessarily come to an advisor or wouldn't have the money, or there'd be some kind of barrier or challenge there. And FIPL has paid us to work with cluster groups to do those farm plans and guide them as to what payments are available for them to make potentially habitat changes or creation or restoration or enhancement. And that's been a game changer for us. And so I do hope it gets extended. I don't know if there's rumours that it will or not, but election year, you never know how it's going to go. So that's been an excellent part. I would say I want to hark back actually a bit to Romilly's advice about point around, you're really right about there's some broad recommendations that advisors can give. I mean, I can sort of say, oh, it would be amazing to connect these habitats, and you're like, oh yeah, that's great. But then actually there's all these minutiae details that I probably couldn't advise you on. So this is where I think another important part of my role in particular as an advisor is that facilitation. So there's so much more. Groundswell is a perfect example of that. There's so much more power and effectiveness when it's farmer to farmer or peer to peer knowledge sharing, and I think cluster groups are the way to do that. And to be honest, that's actually a favourite part of my job, is to bring different people together from opposite ends of the scale, and to run workshops and farm walks and events and to facilitate that conversation. Because I wouldn't be the person to tell you about your sheep and your chemical usage or your fat or something, but another farmer who has got the same experience or going through that with you, a chat with them would help. And I think that's a really large part of what we do, is facilitation of cluster groups.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And yeah, a lot of wildlife trusts are finding that those cluster groups are really important for their work. I want to come to back to Tim again, because I'm a land manager. I've been managing land for about 20 years. And from my point of view, managing land has never been so complicated and so uncertain as well. The impact of extreme weather, and do check out our video about discussion about extreme weather as well. Loss of direct payments, new agri-environment agreements that are kind of stuck in election purdah at the moment while we're waiting for more details. Farmers are going to need to adapt new approaches in order to respond to these different threats. But for Tim, really, are farmers aware of all of these different threats? And how important is advice in helping them to get through those?
There isn't a typical farmer. This is the problem. There really isn't a typical farmer. They're all so different, and they have different drivers and different motivations. And when you go out, you need to establish that relationship first of all, really quickly. And you need to let them know you know what you're talking about. They have to trust you on that. But we do, and thank you, Carrie. It is part of our job to understand these schemes, and we have to dedicate our time. We have to read a lot, and we do have to understand these schemes. They've changed every year recently to keep on top of them, but almost all the farmers I see do not have time to do that. They do not have time to do that. So they will use an advisor if they don't use us. A majority of them are using an advisor to actually guide them through. There has been for a long time so many options, so many actions that they can do. Is why would they look at the ones and pick those in particular? So what we're tending to do at the moment more and more of is look at the whole farm, because I think that scheme needs to integrate with their farming system, and it can help their farming system. But you can't do that immediately when you step onto a farm. You have to understand it and know how it works. But we're doing complete whole farm plans, and we're looking at doing baseline assessments for these farms. And then once we have got that knowledge and we understand them, we can then say, this is what you can do to improve your land for nature, and then we can give them some hand in how to fund that and how to use that. Now, that's the big growing area, is how to fund that. But then doing that for individual farms doesn't really give us the landscape scale we need. So then we need to join up these farms and make these farms work together, which is where the facilitation fund comes in. Fantastic idea in working with farmers, and get them, because they're farming in the same region, they're probably very, very similar farming methods, that they can work together. I mean, there's loads of ways of doing that. They can share machinery, they can do all of this to reduce costs, and maybe we facilitate that too. I'm open to anything, but we want this connectivity across this farm landscape, and that is so important, and we can do that. We know how to do that, but it's how we fund that, and we can make that work and change, really, this landscape of Gloucestershire. And there are so many games for that we can then have this landscape that is, wow, this great landscape that will attract. Sorry, the Cotswolds isn't unknown, is it? Let's face it, the Cotswolds is not unknown, but we can actually bring some of that wonderful grassland back. But this change, and I will say again, we need this untidiness to come back. Please stop being so tidy with the way you manage your gardens and your countryside. It really has to be a lot more untidy than it is.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim. And I'm really interested in this because actually some of this stuff is really not a very easy sell. And let's be honest, we RSPB and we are wildlife trusts, so we're not always the natural person to go to. So I'd like to come to Richard really, and just ask sort of how do farmers respond to an advisor coming from like an RSPB background?
To be honest, in my experience, farmers value high quality advice wherever it comes from, and quite often they can divorce their perception of their advisor from the perception of the organisation. And sometimes, I'll give you one classic story. We were once involved with a dairy company looking at nature-friendly milk, and the RSPB looked into this, and myself and another advisor went on farms and we explored the potential. The RSPB ultimately decided not to go with that, and the Wildlife Trust picked it up and went with White and Wild. And I bumped into one of the farmers a few years later, and I said, how's it going for you, this nature-friendly milk? He says, it's fantastic. He says, it's great. I love it. I love it. I love it. And I've got to remove the expletives, apparently. But he said, the only thing is they've put a badger's head on my milk. Which for a dairy farmer is a little bit of a blow. But he loved the idea that an organisation could work with him to make his product nature-friendly. So I think there's not really an issue with the advice.
Brilliant, yeah, and yeah, we do get some comments about the badger from time to time. I'll give you that. I'd just like to ask the same question of Carrie actually as well. What's your experience of approaching farmers with a badger?
Well, with a badger. Well, I mean, one's next to me, and so I think it's going fairly well. But I think probably similar to Richard's experience. I think on the ground, I've always had a really positive experience with farmers. Although you are coming at it from different angles, I think we meet with mutual respect. I think there is an online perception of the Wildlife Trust being sort of a rewilding charity or anti-farming. But I do think that on the ground, I don't think that's my experience has not been an issue. I think I also never go in pretending that I'm a farmer and know everything about farming. I just think that's deeply offensive to a farmer. So I really respect their knowledge. They work the land every single day, and quite often the case is they've been there 2, 3, 4 generations. So I have a deep respect for that knowledge, and I always go in, or I try to go in as open as I can, and like just want to learn from them. I've learned so much from farmers, and particularly people like Romilly, who's so open about their wisdom and wants to, and has a real pride about their farm and how they farm. And so she spent a day with me, taking me around, talking me through it, and I'm just a sponge. I just soak it up, and I hope, when I come to bring my strengths to the table, then Romilly would be, or other farmers would be open to that as well, because it's sort of bridging that divide, if you like. But certainly meeting them with respect and compassion and empathy, I think, is really key. So, no, I've been very lucky. Haven't had too much of a negative experience. But I'm so interested to hear Romilly. Like, do you like when I was about the cluster group? You're like, oh, she's Wildlife Trust.
To be honest, I didn't know.
Oh.
But, you're right. Advice coming from anywhere. I think that farmers are very aware of the changing goalposts at the moment. It's absolutely boggling. We'd be really stupid to not look at, advice coming from wherever it comes from. And I think there's probably a naturalist in every single farmer. They're out there in their fields. They're watching everything every day. And of course, it's like you've got the two different imperatives. Every farmer wants their land to be healthy, full of nature and beautiful, because that's a much nicer place to stand in and watch. And all of us are heartened by, whatever wildlife greets our day. It's extraordinary. But at the same time, we are having to look at the financial implications of every single decision, down to the minutiae again. But advice is useful wherever it comes from.
That's really good to hear. So one more last question, which we'll ask of each of you. And obviously, so Groundswell is a regenerative agriculture festival primarily, but what you tend to find is that can be quite a difficult journey. I recommend everybody reads Dirt to Soil and find out about how all the different influences behind that, and how it can be a really tough sell. And obviously, regenerative agriculture is going to be important for us. It's going to be a skill that advisors are going to need going forwards. But a lot of farmers are sort of coming to us, and they're sort of saying that they're facing lots of challenges around things like income foregone, and also around a perception of bureaucratic burdens as well involved in this kind of thing. So I'm really interested in what everyone here, what skills are advisors going to need for the future. So to Richard first.
So one thing I would say, I agree with, I think, what Tim and Carrie have said around the benefits of the farmer cluster approach and bringing expertise to facilitating the exchange of expertise. One thing that we used to do with farm wildlife was we used to run expert workshops where we got expert farmers, expert ecologists, and scientists in a field looking at specific options and discussing best practice management from a practical and ecological point of view, and then disseminating that information through Farmers Weekly and getting it out there, just getting that information out there. That's one approach we took. But one important thing going forwards also is we do need accessible, high-quality farm conservation advice, and the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management have created a farm conservation advisor accreditation standard for us, which is on the Farm Wildlife website. And basically, if environmental advisors can all work towards that spec, it's a very broad spectrum thing, but it's basically, it encompasses everything that really farmers and advisors need to get their heads around to really deliver for the environment going forward.
Great stuff. And to Tim, skills for the future?
Very important to have an empathy with the farmers you're working with, and to understand what their problems are. And if you can pick up those quite quickly, and they've got shared problems within your facilitation fund group, you can start finding answers to those problems, and where you can find natural answers to those problems, it's really important. You also have to be really aware of the financial effect of that advice you give. It's going to have an effect on their bottom line, and you have to quite grasp that. But you can help the farm finances. It's that understanding of what you, at a level, it mightn't mean much, but you can actually reduce the risk on farms and reduce their fixed costs by using stewardship carefully and cleverly. So I think you have to get this around stewardship and all of this finance that's available to farmers. And I think that's one of the things that really interests me, is the financial impact stewardship can have on a farm. And the savvy farmers are picking up on that already. Don't worry. The problem is the way that stewardship has been applied, and there's this 25% limit on certain options has been a real issue for me at the moment, and I'm so sorry that's happened. But it's a lot to learn for anybody, and having that joint mix of ecology and farming isn't skills held by that many people. But we can do something about that within an organisation. We can train that. We've got the skills within the trust, and I think it's broadening those skills and probably working between trusts more than we do at the moment will be really important.
Yeah, and working with people like the RSPB as well and other NGOs, so that's really important. So, Carrie, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree with what these guys are saying, especially around all the technical knowledge. Of course, we need to be really well informed, everything. But I do think because change is so hard and there's a lot of psychology around change, it is the ability to build relationships and build that trust. I think farmers are very, actually quite value-driven consumers, if you want to call them consumers. They often go with their heart as well as their mind, and so they want to trust you. And I think those skills are really harder to teach. So, the ability to ask questions, to really listen and then understand is really important. And in terms of skills for the future, I'm kind of looking at one right now. There's someone in the audience. So we've recently recruited a land and farm assistant, moment. And this is building a workforce for the future, because you're quite right. People with knowledge that have both farming and conservation knowledge, there's a massive skills shortage within the industry. So recognising this, we invested in a land and farm assistant, and the idea is this is a 2-year development role. So during those 2 years, they'll be training on the job in both farming and ecology and conservation. At the end of that 2 years, the idea is they become a junior advisor, gain more experience, senior advisor, and so on. And so Alex, I hope you don't mind me saying this, is that her background is not farming or conservation. Her background is actually more finance, project management, and actually GIS, which is another skill set that advisors desperately need too. So, but I would say Alex actually has a bit of an X factor in the interview. It was a really competitive process. We had over 60 applicants. We shortlisted that to 6 interviews, and then Alex and one other got round to his second interviews. So it was a really competitive process. But Alex had the X factor, and that wasn't because she had sorry to embarrass you, but it wasn't because she had like loads of knowledge or anything, but she asked questions. She is builds a rapport quickly, and you can teach everything, but that is a lot harder to teach people. And so it was better to recruit somebody with that natural innate ability to build a relationship and then teach them the rest. And I think when I think about advisors and as a new entrant, and when I do hopefully get my first grazing license, which is fingers crossed very soon, who do I want walking through my door to advise me about how I farm and work? And it is somebody that's open and honest and kind and who genuinely cares about me and my farm, as opposed to just like trying to make a quick buck. So, so I think, that's what I think for the skills for the future.
Brilliant, that sounds really good. And lastly, to Romilly, a slightly different question, but what sort of skills are you looking for when an advisor visits you?
I think empathy has to be the key thing. Every single farmer has a different story. And an advisor needs to be able to hear the individual complications of that story. I have sheep for fleece. I mean, they're incredibly friendly and mob you, but, they're primarily for their fleece. This gives me, massive complications with, like I was saying, about the burrs that stick in their fleece and make it worthless. I need an advisor to understand that that's an issue for me, but that's not, because in Britain, sheep have been primarily kept for meat for so long. The idea of keeping fleece in good condition is rather an outmoded one, and so it's not there up in the sort of kind of financial incentives. So how do I navigate that? I also think that it's about being heard too, because advice might be sort of kind of in this direction, but actually there is a lot to be learned the other way too. And within our farm cluster group, obviously the farmers learn a lot from each other by conversing, but also it's a way of learning what the local concerns of those farmers are, and it gives a mechanism by which advisors can more broadly then learn from those difficult situations, and that can be fed back to other cluster groups, and it makes a more sort of kind of cohesive movement, doesn't it? I think.
Wonderful, and thank you very much, everyone for that. So I thought I'd also just open up for any questions in the audience.
Hi, Andrew Moore from Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, Director of Nature Recovery. My question to you is the scale issue. We've spoken a lot about the individual farmer-to-farmer advice, but a little bit less about the cluster. I'm just interested in both your cases, what impact you've felt that you've had at a scale using the cluster system, and are there limits to that, and what should be direct farmer to farmer, and what can be done through the cluster system to make significant change?
We've only just got our facilitation funds, so we haven't used it that much. And what I have done, I've got experience of, is using something called Innovative Farmers, and that was a great way of doing something. So a couple of the farmers that have joined this facilitation fund have said to me they don't want it to be a talking shop, and I think it's keeping it active. And that's sort of the culture of Innovative Farmers, was running field trials on their farms. I think that gives them some action, and it means doing something. And it's finding answers to problems as well. That's really important. and it involves people more. And then if you can replicate that at a landscape scale, part of that could be benchmarking stewardship options and things like, if we're using that option and some of the farms are, say, interested in grey partridge numbers, and then we can use that, look at the interventions and things we can do for that, and then scale that across all of the farms and learn from each other, from good practice. So that's what I'll be looking to use the facilitation fund for, really, is benchmarking very much the farms against each other and getting perhaps some competition in there, some nice friendly competition to say who's doing best. But we have to make these things not become talking shops, and we're really aware of that. I hope that answers something of the...
Brilliant question. Oh, hello. Yes, brilliant question. I love facilitating cluster groups, and I know some people don't. I'm like, don't understand it. So I've had a varied experience with it. So in the Peak District, I started a cluster group called Peak Regenerative Farmers, and that was for National Trust tenants. And that was a 2-year educational programme running workshops and farm walks, that peer-to-peer knowledge, essentially, that was lacking in the area. And I felt, so the High Peak, so that's based in like Edale area, went for a landscape recovery scheme, and that was the last thing I did before I moved to the Wildlife Trust with the National Trust, was to get them a landscape recovery scheme. And I don't think they would have been successful if it hadn't have been for the influence of the Peak Regenerative Farmers, because I was able to build a long-term relationship with the farmers that were involved with the group, so they were able to trust me and the National Trust enough to sign up for that landscape recovery scheme and to support the development of it. So that was definitely a direct impact, as well as individual actions that would help facilitate on the farm, so like wooded corridor creation, wood pasture creation. That was all through sort of like this kind of cluster group kind of approach. And then when I moved down to Oxfordshire just like 9 months ago, I really missed my cluster group and I wanted to facilitate more. So I was brazen and I threw myself out there and I was like, I'll facilitate any group, tell me what's happening. So I am facilitator of the South Chilterns cluster group, which is what Romilly is part of as a steering group there. And this is a brand new cluster group. So we've only just started. I think we had our first sort of kind of feeler, like putting the feelers out meeting in February. We've had a steering group meeting this spring, and now we're here. And I would say what's been useful in this really early stage process of it was setting the objectives of the cluster group, of which we've got 3: habitat creation and restoration, and that was particularly focusing on the passions and the interest of the farmers. So that was, in this case, chalk grassland, floodplain meadows, and your wooded habitats, because this cluster group's got a lot of woodland. And so that really honed my effort into being, okay, this is what we need to focus on, because this is what the farmers are going to change and action, because it's their passion. The second is local food systems. You know, farmers are farmers, they produce food, and so a cluster group isn't just about nature and countryside stewardship, it is about local food systems, and where you've got a great opportunity to be supplying the local food chain and the local food system through butchers, farm shops. It's quite a wealthy area, isn't it? Don't mind me saying that to you. So, you know, there's a prime audience for this sort of locally sustainable food. So we're hoping to get funding for an opportunity study to look at that and the local food systems. And tied into the habitat management and creation was deer management with the wooded habitats, and that would be tied in with the opportunity mapping of routes to market for venison and local food. And then the third is the collective power of the cluster group as well. So that's, you know, shared resources, is there buying power for this cluster group and things like that. And I think that objective setting exercise that we did at a pub over dinner was a brilliant way of going, okay, this is the actions that this cluster group is going to take, and my role as facilitator is to help them do that. So I think that was a really useful early doors exercise of a new cluster group. I facilitate another cluster group that's a little bit further down the line, very large estates in the Berkshire-Hampshire border, and that's interesting. So we've used FIPL funding to do the baseline surveys, the farm plans, to facilitate the individual action as well. So that's been a really brilliant experience, especially with FIPL, to facilitate that change. So I hope that helps with the landscape, because that's over 5,000 hectares that estate runs. So cluster groups, I think, are a brilliant way of doing landscape scale change.
Brilliant. Any other questions? If not, that just leaves me to thank our panel, Richard, Tim, Carrie and Romilly. And I really appreciate your time. It's been really interested. And I'll just say to everyone, watch this space. Advice is incredibly important going forwards. And it's something we're going to really focus on. And if you have any more questions about advice, do come up and talk to one of the panel. But thank you very much.